Groblershoop woke up to a shock this week, not from the heat of the Northern Cape sun, but from the heat of a scandal that has rattled trust in our social grant system. A 61-year-old woman, someone who should be enjoying her retirement years, now faces serious criminal charges in a scheme involving SASSA cards, fraudulent loans, and the very money meant to put food on the tables of vulnerable South Africans. This is not just another headline. It's a wake-up call. Because if one person can find a way to manipulate the grant system, it means there may be others, and that means your pension or grant could be at risk too. For many South Africans, the SASSA card is more than just a piece of plastic. It's survival. It's medicine at the end of the month. It's a bag of groceries when the cupboard is bare. But in this case, that lifeline was allegedly used in an illegal loan scheme where cards and pins were collected, money withdrawn, and desperate recipients left with even less than before. Authorities say the woman's arrest is just the tip of the iceberg. Investigations are pointing toward a bigger network, possibly targeting rural towns where seniors and grant beneficiaries might not have easy access to banking advice or legal help. If you rely on a pension or grant, this is your moment to pay close attention. Because knowing how these scams work could be the difference between keeping your hard-earned money safe or losing it to someone who sees your need as their opportunity. In this video, we are breaking down exactly what happened in Groblershoop, how these fraudulent schemes are pulling in unsuspecting victims, and most importantly, what you can do to protect your grant or pension. No sugarcoating, no political spin, just the facts that matter for your safety and your pocket. Because in times like these, real information is not just power, it's protection. Now, let's unpack what actually happened in Groblershoop, because the more we understand the details, the more we can see how something like this could happen in any town or city in South Africa, and more importantly, how to stop it before it reaches our own families. From the outside, this might just look like a simple arrest, a 61-year-old woman taken into custody for allegedly being part of a SASSA grant loan scam. But when you dig deeper, you realize that these cases are rarely about just one person acting alone. They are about networks, loopholes, and a system that is often stretched too thin to protect every vulnerable beneficiary. And that's where the danger lies. According to local reports, this woman wasn't just borrowing a card or helping someone in need, she was allegedly running a setup where people desperate for quick cash were handing over their SASSA cards and PIN numbers in exchange for small loans. Sometimes it was a 200, sometimes a 500, depending on what the person needed urgently. But here's the catch, when the grant or pension payment came in, she would withdraw a much larger amount than what was loaned out, keeping the extra for herself as so-called interest. The problem is, this wasn't a legal loan business, and that interest wasn't regulated. In some cases, people ended up losing half their grant before they even touched it, and if they tried to complain. Well, in small communities, fear and embarrassment keep many people silent. Now, you might wonder, why would anyone hand over their SASSA card in the first place? And the answer is both heartbreaking and frustrating. It's because many people living on pensions or grants find themselves stuck between payments with no food, no electricity, and sometimes urgent needs like medicine or funeral costs. In rural areas like Groblershoop, banks are far, public transport costs money, and people often rely on local helpers who they believe they can trust. But trust is exactly what scammers prey on. They start out friendly, offering small favors, helping with groceries, maybe even paying for airtime now and then. Then, once the relationship feels secure, the offers of loans begin. That's when the trap is set. The arrest in Groblershoop is a reminder that these schemes don't just take money, they take dignity. For an elderly person who has worked all their life or depended on a government grant, to then have to beg for their own money back is deeply humiliating. And it's not just the seniors, people with disabilities, unemployed parents, and caregivers who depend on child grants are often targeted too. The system is supposed to be a safety net, but for some, it's starting to feel like a fishing net, one where you can be caught and dragged into debt before you even realize what's happening. What's especially worrying is how easy it is for scammers to operate under the radar. In bigger cities, fraud cases can sometimes be spotted quickly because of better technology and more oversight. But in rural towns, where SASSA offices are smaller and overworked, things can slip through the cracks. And remember, these scams aren't always high-tech. They can be as simple as a notebook, a few bank slips, and word of mouth. Sometimes there's no paper trail at all, just an agreement between two people that later turns into exploitation. The authorities are saying this arrest is part of a bigger investigation, and if that's true, it means there may be more people involved, perhaps even people working within certain institutions who turn a blind eye or pass along information. That's why awareness is so important. If you're watching this and thinking, I would never fall for something like that, it's worth remembering that these schemes don't always look like scams at first. They often start out looking like help. And when you're in a desperate situation, the brain doesn't always think about the long-term risk. It's focused on the immediate problem, the empty fridge, the unpaid electricity meter, the urgent bus ticket to see a sick relative. I've spoken to pensioners who tell me they knew something wasn't right, but they thought they'd be able to pay it back just once and never do it again. But then life throws another curveball, and before they know it, the cycle continues. And the saddest part, sometimes it's people we know, neighbors, family, friends, even distant relatives, who are behind these scams. They justify it by saying, everyone does it, or it's just business. But there's nothing fair or businesslike about taking half of some survival income. Now, let's talk about what's at stake here beyond the immediate theft. The more these scams happen, the more mistrust builds in our social grant system. When people hear about fraud, they start to wonder if their money is safe, if their personal details are secure, and if the system will collapse under abuse. That's dangerous because a breakdown in trust can push more people into hiding problems instead of reporting them. And if nobody reports, the scammers keep winning. This is why it's important to have open conversations in our communities about what's going on. Too many of us think talking about money is shameful, especially when it involves debt or being scammed. But the silence only protects the wrong people. By sharing stories and warning others, we actually make it harder for scammers to operate. It's like turning on a light in a dark room, the cockroaches scatter. Authorities say one of the biggest challenges in cracking down on these crimes is that many victims refuse to give statements or press charges. Sometimes it's fear of revenge, sometimes it's loyalty, and sometimes it's because they feel ashamed for being foolish. But here's the truth, getting scammed doesn't mean you're foolish, it means someone else decided to take advantage of your trust or your desperation. That's on them, not you. And the more we recognize that, the stronger we become as a community. In the coming months, it's likely we'll hear more about this Groblershoop case, especially if more arrests are made. And when that happens, I want you to think about your own circle. Who do you know that depends on a SASSA grant? Have they been offered loans in exchange for their card? Do they keep their PIN written down somewhere that others might find it? Have they recently had deductions from their grant they can't explain? These are the conversations that can save someone from losing money they can't afford to lose. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that scams like this thrive because of poverty. If grants and pensions were enough to live on comfortably, there'd be far less need to take loans in the first place. That's a bigger discussion about policy, inflation, and the rising cost of living in South Africa, but it's part of the reality. We can't ignore the fact that people turn to these dangerous arrangements because they feel they have no other choice. That's why any solution has to address both prevention and support.